From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Army teachers is half brain and half cop. Army teachers is toxic lunacy, literally harebrained, half cop, creating more danger in schools, not less.
As President Trump advocates for arming teachers, lawmakers return to Capitol Hill under intense pressure to pass gun control measures. Even as a student movement rises, gun manufacturers are targeting young people. We'll speak with The Intercept's investigative journalist Lee Fang. We'll also talk with Lee Fang about how the Supreme Court will hear arguments today in a key case that could deal a blow to unions nationwide. Among the key donors backing the conservative cause, the Koch brothers.
We've made more progress in the last 5 years than I had in the previous 50.
Then it's been 6 months since Hurricane Harvey flooded Houston, the most diverse city in the United States, home to the nation's largest refining and petrochemical complex.
Talk about the invisibility, and you talk about where the population lives. You talk about not only a disaster in terms of the flooding, you talk about a disaster in terms of the environment, the pollution, the health threats, the potential for the kinds of impacts that we will see, years to come.
We'll host a roundtable discussion with Dr. Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice, Brian Paris of the Sierra Club, and Cesar Espinosa, executive director of Fiel, and Goldman Environmental Prize winner Hilton Kelly. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Syrian government forces are continuing to bomb rebel-held eastern Ghouta 2 days after the United Nations Security Council unanimously backed a 30-day ceasefire. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, at least 9 people have died in shelling in eastern Ghouta over the past day. More than 500 have been killed there over the past week. Meanwhile, Turkey's continuing its offensive in the Kurdish-held town of Afrin. At the United Nations, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres urged all sides to implement the ceasefire.
Eastern Ghouta cannot wait. It's high time to stop this hell on earth. And I remind all parties of their absolute obligation under international humanitarian and human rights law to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure at all times. And similarly, efforts to combat terrorism do not supersede these obligations. In
Parkland, Florida, students returned to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School Sunday afternoon for the first time since February 14th, when a 19-year-old white former student named Nicholas Cruz walked into the school and opened fire with an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, killing 17 people. Outside the school, students talked about what it felt like to return to the scene of the killing.
I'm kind of scared what it's going to be like going back and not seeing Aaron Feist at the front gate, like his big smile, waving, and then our little stupid conversations, which I miss them. And then,
He was a really good kid your years.
Yeah. And him dying a hero, saving 6 kids and staying on top of them. I'm happy he did that. It's not going to be the same. Not in the mornings. Not when I leave. Not seeing his face, not seeing him on the golf cart. It's going to be different.
Meanwhile, the Florida House Speaker and 73 Republican colleagues have called on Florida Governor Rick Scott to suspend Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel for not doing more to prevent the shooting. Records show Broward County deputies received at least 18 calls about the gunman Nicholas Cruz over the past decade, including one warning he, quote, planned to shoot up the school. This comes as massive pressure is growing for lawmakers to enact new gun control measures amidst the rise of an unprecedented youth movement led by survivors of the February 14th shooting. A new CNN poll shows the percentage of Americans favoring stricter gun control laws has risen from 52% to 70% over the past 4 months. While Congress returns to session today, Republican lawmakers have yet to announce any plans for new gun legislation. The NRA has publicly opposed calls for a ban on bump stocks and raising the age requirement to purchase a long gun from 18 to 21. But pressure is growing on the NRA. Since the Parkland shooting, more than 20 companies have cut ties to the NRA. The list includes Delta Airlines, United, Hertz, Avis, Budget, MetLife, and the First National Bank of Omaha. President Trump's former deputy campaign manager, Rick Gates, has pled guilty to 2 charges, is now cooperating with special counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. The charges deal with work Gates did in Ukraine with Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, before they joined the Trump campaign. New charges have also been filed against Manafort, in part around an effort to secretly finance lobbying for Ukraine's government. Meanwhile, Democratic lawmakers have released a memo refuting key parts of the recent Republican memo that purported to show the FBI and Justice Department abused their authority by placing Trump campaign advisor Carter Page under surveillance in 2016 over his ties to Russia. Democratic Congressmember Adam Schiff said his memo shows the FBI acted appropriately.
The FISA court was informed that Carter Page had a history that the FBI knew of well before the Trump campaign, that he was the target, effectively, of Russian recruitment, that the court was informed that another Trump foreign policy advisor who occupied the same kind of position as Carter Page had similarly been approached by Russian agents and informed that the Russians had damaging information on Hillary Clinton in the form of thousands of emails.
In business news, the Weinstein Company is reportedly preparing to file for bankruptcy. This comes after 100 women accused the company's former chairman, Harvey Weinstein, of sexual misconduct, including rape. New York's Attorney General Eric Schneiderman recently sued the company and Harvey Weinstein over sexual harassment and misconduct. In political news, the California Democratic Party has voted not to endorse longtime Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein in her bid to win a 6th term. Feinstein's being challenged from the left by California State Senate leader Kevin De Leon. At their annual convention in San Diego, California Democrats voted 54% to 37% to back De Leon, who has also been endorsed by SEIU, the Service Employees International Union. On Saturday, De Leon said, quote, "The days of Democrats biding our time, biting our tongue, and triangulating at the margins are over." The political news website Axios is reporting President Trump has privately told friends and staffers he wants to execute drug dealers. One senior administration official told Axios he often jokes about killing drug dealers. He'll say, you know, the Chinese and Filipinos don't have a drug problem, they just kill them. Earlier this month, the International Criminal Court opened a preliminary investigation into accusations Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte had committed crimes against humanity by overseeing the killing of up to 8,000 people in his so-called war on drugs. The Trump administration announced harsh new sanctions against North Korea Friday, just before the Olympic Games ended in South Korea. During the Games, North Korean officials met with their South Korean counterparts and reportedly expressed a willingness to hold talks with the United States. The State Department has announced the United States will move its embassy in Israel to Jerusalem in May to coincide with the 70th anniversary of Israel's Declaration of Independence, or what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, or catastrophe. Chief Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat criticized the U.S. announcement.
The American administration to choose the date of the Palestinian catastrophe, the Nakba, to move the embassy and to take this move in this expeditious fashion reflects total insensitivities to what goes on in this region, which reiterates, which reaffirms our position that the U.S. can no longer be part of the peace process.
One of the biggest proponents of the embassy move to Jerusalem has been billionaire casino magnate Sheldon Adelson. He's now offering to help fund the construction of the new embassy, which could cost as much as $500 million. In other news from Israel, up to 20,000 people rallied in Tel Aviv Saturday to protest Israel's plans to push out as many as 40,000 African migrants in the coming months. Israel's threatening to jail the migrants if they don't leave Israel. Protesters Saturday condemned the Israeli government for shutting the door on refugees.
We came to demonstrate against deportation. We disagree with the decision of our government, especially as Jews. We are people of refugees, of asylum seekers for 2,000 years, and we are here to say, now that we are in a sovereign state, we have to deal with other asylum seekers worldwide.
Back in the United States, Oakland, California Mayor Libby Schaaf held an unusual news conference Sunday, warning residents of a possible ICE raid in the coming days.
Today, I learned information from multiple sources that there is potentially an ICE activity planned in the Bay Area that could be starting as soon as today. My priority is to keep this community safe. It is not my wish to panic people, but to ensure that they're prepared with information, that they know their rights as well as their responsibilities, and know about the resources that this
Oakland is a sanctuary city, which has barred city employees from assisting ICE raids. In environmental news, a federal judge in Louisiana has revoked a permit for a new crude oil pipeline by Energy Transfer Partners, the same firm which runs the Dakota Access Pipeline. The Bayou Bridge pipeline has been opposed by a coalition of environmental groups as well as local fishermen. In West Virginia, teachers have begun their third day on strike. The strike has shut down all the state's public schools. Teacher salaries in West Virginia are lower than in all but 2 other states, with salaries beginning at just over $32,000 for a new teacher. And in other labor news, the U.S. Supreme Court is set to hear arguments today in a key case that could deal a massive blow to unions nationwide. The case deals with whether workers who are covered by union-negotiated contracts are required to pay a portion of union dues, even if they are not members of the union. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. In Parkland, Florida, students returned to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School on Sunday afternoon. It was their first time inside their school since February 14, when a 19-year-old former student, Nicholas Cruz, walked into the school and opened fire with an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, killing 17 people. The students' return is part of what school officials are calling a phased reopening of the school. This comes as lawmakers return to Capitol Hill today. After a vacation, Congress is facing massive pressure to pass gun control measures amidst the rise of an unprecedented youth movement led by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School students who survived the mass shooting. Meanwhile, President Trump has reiterated his calls to arm teachers with concealed weapons. This is Trump speaking at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference on Friday.
The beauty is it's concealed. Nobody would ever see it unless they needed it. It's concealed. So this crazy man who walked in wouldn't even know who it is that has it. That's good. It's not bad. That's good. And a teacher would have shot the hell out of him before he knew what happened. They love their students. They love those students, folks. Remember that.
According to the Gun Violence Archive, at least 69 kids under the age of 18 have been shot, and 26 of them were killed since the mass shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School less than 2 weeks ago. Well, to speak more about firearms, gun manufacturers, and the unprecedented youth movement for gun control, we're joined now by The Intercept's investigative reporter Lee Fang. His new piece headlined, "Even as a student movement rises, gun manufacturers are targeting young people." Lee, welcome back to Democracy Now! How are gun manufacturers targeting young people?
Hi, Amy. Thanks for having me. We took a look at investor reports from gun manufacturers and other gun industry companies. And there's a number of reasons why, but gun executives say they're making a new push to target younger generations, teenagers, millennials, mainly because gun sales have been plummeting over the last year. That's partially because with a Republican president and Republicans in power in Congress, there's been little fear of gun control. And what the gun industry has done historically is that they've used the potential for gun control to spur panic buying, often using third parties like the NRA to kind of whip up hysteria. And without that kind of fear of gun control, there's been less gun sales, so they're attempting to grow their market. Also, there's new analysis from the gun industry showing that young people are not buying guns like older generations for hunting. They're mostly kind of emulating video game culture. They're going to gun stores, buying targets of vampires and zombies and going to the gun range and buying really sophisticated weapons, lots of ammunition. This is really, as one gun industry executive said, the Xbox generation that they're trying to target. So even as there's a new youth-led student movement calling for gun control, this is coming at a time when the gun industry is hoping to grow their market share by selling more guns to young people.
And Lee, could you also talk about the Koch brothers and guns and the network that the Koch brothers have built up to fund campaigns, both advocacy campaigns and political campaigns?
Well, the interesting thing here with the Koch brothers and guns is that I don't believe that the Koch brothers have, a strong interest in gun control or no gun control, but they do understand that this is an issue that whips up the conservative base, that Republican voters are very likely to vote on gun issues. So, historically, we've seen the Koch brothers use their undisclosed money organizations to fund the NRA. That's because the NRA will go out and engage in election efforts to activate Republican-based voters to get them to the polls. So, when you see television advertisements from the NRA, that money does come from NRA members, from gun companies, but it also can come from groups like the Koch brothers that are hoping to use them as kind of an identity group to activate their base voters.
Can you talk a little about American Outdoor Brands? It used to be known as Smith & Wesson, right?
That's right. This is a company that sells a number of different rifles, formerly known as Smith & Wesson. They manufactured the AR-15 that was used in the Parkland massacre. And this is a company that has donated millions of dollars to the NRA. They've engaged in kind of marketing practices with the NRA, saying that if you buy a certain number of weapons, if you buy guns from us, a portion of the sales will go to the NRA. They've gone out and provided big checks to the NRA as well, kind of celebrating their partnership. And it's a major company, that sells weapons in retail stores all around the country.
And tell us about James Debney, the CEO of American Outdoor, talking further.
Right. James Debney has been the longtime chief executive. And as he kind of explained in investor presentations throughout the year last year, he talked about the need to grow their market share among young people, that the company is doing more marketing towards younger generations and targeting millennials. Again, if you look at just the stock price of the major gun companies, of American Outdoor Brands, but also Sturm & Ruger, Vista Outdoor. These are the largest gun and ammunition companies. They've really tanked over the last year. So these companies are hurting. They're hoping to bring in new consumers, and they're noticing that young people are very particular types of consumers. They're buying guns to kind of emulate first-person shooters, and the gun companies are very conscious of this and trying to market their weapons to them.
And what do you make of the decision by some of the major corporations in America now to sort of cut their ties with the NRA, get rid of credit cards, NRA credit cards by some of the financial institutions? What's your sense of what that represents?
I think it's an interesting development, but the NRA is organized through multiple 501c tax entities, we don't really understand their financials because they don't disclose their donors. How much of a hit this constitutes, we don't know. It's certainly not a positive development for the NRA to see so many major corporations, from airlines to car rental companies, cutting their financial ties with the group. But at the same time, the NRA is a big money organization. They can fundraise not just from their members, but from gun companies and other Republican donors. I think it's too early to be seen what this financial impact is. I think the NRA is going to spend a lot of money this year, especially if states or Congress picks up gun control. They will use those political developments to kind of activate their base and likely receive even more donations.
Lee, as you write about the efforts by gun manufacturers to market to young people through magazines like Junior Shooter, we're showing some of the covers of the magazine for our viewers, which show young people holding rifles and handguns with cover lines like Glocks are for girls and Meet Spud, Fast Draw at age 11. Other companies, including gun manufacturer Hogue Inc., sell things like green glow-in-the-dark handguns and shotguns and accessories marketed to kids so they can, quote, hunt zombies in style, you referred to earlier. Explain the whole push to go to younger and younger people.
Right, and this is not something that's particularly new. The gun companies have been doing this for a while. We're just seeing kind of an increased effort. But just like any other major consumer industry, the gun company knows that they will have more loyal and more active consumers if they target people who are very young, to kind of lock them in as buyers who will repeatedly go out and buy weapons and accessories and ammunition. So we see these marketing efforts targeted explicitly to children, with guns that kind of look like they're from a video game, or they're pink and very friendly looking weapons. There's been partnerships even with video game companies. Electronic Arts several years ago had a partnership with several gun companies where, for a first-person shooter, players could play the game and then be directly connected to a marketplace where they could buy weapons from the game directly from the manufacturers. So there's a multitude of marketing efforts that are geared towards young people. And I think if Congress is looking towards enacting gun control, the marketing efforts might be a part of that larger national conversation.
And Lee, speaking of marketing efforts, I want to ask you about another big marketing effort. The Koch brothers are talking about spending somewhere between $400 and $500 million on the upcoming midterm elections. And could you talk about their network, the seminar network that you've looked into, and what the impact of such huge spending could be on these upcoming elections?
Well, look, the Koch brothers for over a decade now have organized other Republican donors. These are billionaires, very wealthy donors, to attend secret gatherings with the Koch brothers to pledge money to the Koch network. And this Koch network money goes to a range of groups, different think tanks, university efforts, but also the campaign advertisements and grassroots efforts to get out the vote. The seminar network is an effort to institutionalize this fundraising network. They meet twice a year. There was a recent meeting in Indian Wells where about 500 different donors came to listen to the Koch brothers and update them about their strategy. And the big priority for the Koch brothers this year in this midterm election is to preserve the Republican majorities in Congress and to continue to elect Republicans on the state level. And there's kind of two big efforts that are going on right now. They're very worried about the upcoming census that will redraw the political maps in every single state just in 2 years. So whoever controls the legislatures after this midterm elections will draw the maps for the next decade. They're also concerned that Republicans will lose control of the Senate. So they're going on offense for a lot of Democratic senators who are incumbents right now. We already see TV ads all across the country, places like Indiana and Missouri, where there are vulnerable Democratic senators. In states where Trump won the election, they're already on air. They're hiring staffers to go out and organize efforts, using groups like Americans for Prosperity. But they're playing offense, hoping to pick up some Democratic seats while protecting the Republican majority.
I want to turn to Charles Koch, CEO of Koch Industries, making his opening remarks at the Seminar Network last month in Palm Springs.
We've made more progress in the last 5 years than I had in the previous 50. Central to our accelerated progress is that we have followed and increasingly followed the philosophy that made Frederick Douglass such an effective social change entrepreneur. And that is, as he put it, to unite with anybody to do right and no one to do wrong.
So if you can talk about the overall agenda and also Capitol Hill lobbyists, they're not only funding think tanks, but also polling organizations. And your recent piece about the Koch brothers targeting Claire McCaskill in Missouri for opposing Republican tax cuts.
Right. You know, in the backdrop of a very chaotic first year, Donald Trump has actually helped achieve much of what the Koch brothers have lobbied for a very long time in really rapid succession. You know, in three primary areas that we talk about in the piece. You know, the Republicans in Congress and Trump enacted tax cuts that the Koch brothers have fought very hard for, and these are tax cuts weighted to the top. There's a recent estimate that said that each Koch brother, David and Charles Koch, will receive $500 million per year. That's an estimate just from the tax bill alone. There's also the regulatory state. The Trump administration, with many appointees coming directly from the Koch network, have handed out a number of rulings and changes to regulations that are beneficial to the Koch brothers, primarily in the area of environmental rules. And then the judiciary. The Koch brothers have pushed very hard for long systemic change, and Donald Trump is on pace to break records with a number of federal appointments to the judiciary. He's appointing judges to the district and appellate level at an unprecedented rate. And these are lifetime appointments. These are judges that will be there for another 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40 years, so that maybe if there is a progressive or Democratic president in Congress after Trump leaves office, these judges will be there to potentially invalidate any rules that come out of, or any laws that come out of a more progressive administration.
Very quickly, McCaskill.
And Claire McCaskill is a senator who voted against the tax cuts, so that upset the Koch brothers. But she's, you know, a very vulnerable Democratic senator. She's in a state that Trump won big in Missouri, and so that's going to be a very aggressive Senate campaign. That's part of the kind of basket of Democratic seats that the Koch brothers hope to pick up for Republicans. So, you know, even if Republicans suffer elsewhere in terms of the congressional elections, they're hoping to play offense and pick up that seat.
Well, Lee, speaking about the Koch brothers, the U.S. Supreme Court is set to hear arguments today in a key case that could deal a massive blow to unions nationwide. The case is called Janus v. American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, and it deals with whether workers who are covered by union negotiated contracts are required to pay a portion of union dues, even if they are not members of the union. In 2016, after conservative Justice Antonin Scalia died, suddenly the Supreme Court deadlocked 4-4 on the case. But now it's expected that Trump appointee Justice Neil Gorsuch will break this tie by ruling against the unions. Right-wing and conservative donors have poured money into this case and other efforts to weaken unions. The New York Times had a big piece about how the conservative donor base around this case. Could you talk about the importance of the case?
This Janus case could be the most devastating blow to progressive politics since the Citizens United decision. Simply put, if this case goes through, and it's looking very likely with Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court that they will decide in favor of the plaintiffs, it will allow, as you mentioned, right-to-work rules for public sector employees nationwide. That means that even for members or non-members of unions, unions can no longer withdraw what's called agency fees. That's the kind of money that's deducted from a paycheck to represent a worker under contract. And when unions can no longer collect those fees, as we've seen on the private sector side, many unions kind of enter a death spiral. It becomes harder to retain members. There are opt-out campaigns. There's decertification campaigns. Members leave the unions. And because public sector unions, teacher unions in particular, are some of the biggest donors to progressive politics, funding progressive Democrats, especially on the state level. Sometimes they're the largest donors to progressive campaigns for office. The effects can simply be devastating.
Lee Fong, we want to thank you very much for being with us, investigative journalist at The Intercept, covering the intersection of money and politics. His recent article, Even as a Student Movement Rises, Gun Manufacturers Are Targeting Young People. We'll link to that piece, as well as Koch document reveals laundry list of policy victories extracted from the Trump administration. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, it's the 6-month anniversary of Hurricane Harvey hitting Houston. We'll talk with various people from Houston about what's happened since then. Stay with us.
A young cowboy named Billy Joe grew restless on the farm. A boy filled with wanderlust who really meant no harm. He changed his clothes and shined his boots and combed his dark hair down. And his mother cried as he walked out, "Don't take your guns to town, son. Leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town." He laughed and kissed his mom and said, "You're Billy Joe's a man. I can shoot as quick and straight as anybody can. But I wouldn't shoot without a cause, I'd gun nobody down." But she cried again as he rode away, "Don't take your guns to town, son. Leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town." He sang a song as on he rode, his guns hung at his hips. He rode into a cattle
Johnny
town.
Cash singing Don't Take Your Guns to Town. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, this week marks 6 months since Hurricane Harvey caused historic flooding in Houston, Texas, the 4th largest city in the United States and one of the most diverse cities in the nation. Houston is also home to the largest refining and petrochemical complex in the country. We'll spend the rest of the hour looking at the state of environmental justice in Houston since the storm. As federal money for rebuilding trickles in, Houston's chief recovery czar is the president of Shell Oil, Marvin Odom, whose past experience includes rebuilding Shell's oil and gas facilities after Hurricane Katrina. This is Odom speaking Thursday.
This recovery is also an opportunity to take an enormous step forward in achieving the vision of ensuring access to an affordable and safe home for every resident. And to that end, we are also coordinating, again, with a look around the room, with private and philanthropic funding sources, particularly now, as the mayor said, to fill the gap before the federal funds get here.
This comes as newly released federal records obtained by the Associated Press show it took nearly 4 times as long to house people in trailers after Harvey as Hurricane Katrina, and repairs to houses have been much slower than after 2012 Superstorm Sandy. Immigrants in fence-line communities who suffer from pollution along Houston's industrial corridor are still largely absent from much of the discussion about how the city plans to recover. Well, today we get an update from people working to change that, who first joined us in the weeks following Hurricane Harvey when we went down to Houston. We host a roundtable discussion with Dr. Robert Bullard, father of environmental justice, Brian Paris of the Sierra Club, undocumented immigrant activist Cesar Espinosa, and Goldman Environmental Prize winner Hilton Kelly, who just received his FEMA trailer. I want to begin with Dr. Robert Bullard, whose house we visited just after he'd been evacuated and then come back. Dr. Bullard's a distinguished professor at Texas Southern University on the steering committee of the Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience. His books include Invisible Houston, The Black Experience, and Boom and Bust. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Dr. Bullard. 6 months after, what is the state of Houston for the different communities, and how disparate has been the response to them in cleanup?
Well, Houston is is a big city, and it has very diverse communities, and there were extreme inequality when it comes to environmental protection and land use and problems related to land and air quality. And Harvey exacerbated and made those inequalities and disparities come alive and be more apparent in terms of the larger community. And so what we've seen is that many communities are bouncing back, have come back, and those resources are able to get back quicker. And it should be no surprise, or it's not rocket science to understand that disasters exacerbate inequality. And so those communities that struggle before the storm are still struggling after. And so what we have to do is to ensure that all boats rise and all communities are able to recover in a way that make them much more resilient and much healthier when resources flow into the city.
And Dr. Bullard, talking about those resources, the Trump administration initially got a lot of praise for its response to Harvey's impact, but that hasn't followed through. I understand the mayor of Houston recently complained that only 1,100 households have been approved by FEMA for assistance, where there were 345,000 households that were affected. Your sense of how the federal response has either exacerbated or ameliorated the inequities that existed in Houston before the storm?
Well, if you look at those families and households that have nest eggs and resources actually started to recover and rebuild shortly as after the water receded and they were able to get back in muck and gut. But for those families and households that are more vulnerable and need assistance from the feds and may not have had insurance or may not have had any private funds of their own to fix up and rebuild, they're still waiting. And I think it's important that we understand that we have a recovery going on, and Houston is very entrepreneurial and prides itself as taking charge. But there's still that invisible side of Houston that historically have gotten left behind before there were storms and floods, and so I think that's where we have a large segment of our community that is still waiting and suffering, and I think that's the sad thing about it, that it slipped off the radar for the most part, and it's but that's no less a priority that has to be dealt with.
I want to go to Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who said the state expects to receive more than $1 billion from FEMA for hazard mitigation projects like home buyouts and elevations or to build seawalls. Governor Abbott speaking in January.
Now, we have said from the very beginning that as we rebuild, we wanted to do more than just rebuild like it was before. We wanted to rebuild in a way that would reduce future risk to property and to lives. And that is precisely the definition of what hazard mitigation funds are for.
This comes as officials in Harris County, where Houston is located, plan to ask voters to approve at least $1 billion to help pay for flood control projects. Talk about how this funding is being spent, Dr. Bullard.
Well, I think the issue for many of us who have been working with communities for many years in Houston is that there oftentimes is no level of transparency as to what the regular person on the street understand, how decisions are being made and how plans are being developed. And I think the whole idea of trying to get a sense of will money follow need or will money follow power? And the idea of mitigation, the flood mitigation is very important, that we talk about rebuilding and recovering in a way that we don't reproduce the inequality that existed before. So when we talk about an environmental justice standpoint, it has to be fair and equitable, and it's flooding plus. It's also not just flooding that the issues that we are concerned about. It's also those upsets and restarts, shutdowns of these industries that created lots of pollution during this storm, but also emitted lots of pollution before the storm. And those are kinds of things we have to also deal with. The lack of addressing the environmental problems, the Superfund sites that were flooded, the communities that have been flooded routinely in the last 3 years that before that was Harvey. And so those are things that I think we have to look at and make sure that resources and plans are put into the system, and that there's a good civic engagement plan and opportunity for people to involve themselves in the decision making, as opposed to individuals making decisions at the top and then announcing it. That's what I think we're talking about, and when our coalition that has come about because of wanting to get more citizens participation and public input into the process.
Well, we're also joined by Brian Paris, who's an organizer for the Sierra Club, and I wanted to ask you about the impact of the obviously the petrochemical industry is centered there in Houston. What we know about the spills and the pollution that occurred during the storm and afterwards, and how the monitoring of public health is going on.
Well, thank you all. And on the cusp of the Supreme Court decision, I want to express my solidarity with the union workers. I've got my union shirt on, a proud member. And you know, it's an excellent point to make, because what we've seen in Houston and places of communities that live so close to these facilities, the health impacts aren't always immediately seen. They take years and years to gestate, sometimes decades. And right now, there are a number of entities doing research projects to look at some of these health impacts. UT Health, Baylor College of Medicine, Texas A&M. And one thing I will say is that, you know, Houston and the communities and community groups like Tejas and Cocoa and others that are starting in Pasadena and other parts of the city, you know, are getting organized, and they are documenting these health impacts. You know, they're working with researchers, and we're probably going to see, you know, a big health impact as a result of this. I've been to several funerals just in the last 2 months, you know, way more than usual. And whether those are related or not, directly or indirectly to the storm, it's a fact. It's happening. You know, the stress alone from, you know, being in these storms and the unknowing, you know, and the risk that, you know, are being taken at these facilities, you know, is just a lot for any person.
Brian, we were with you in Houston as you took us on a toxic tour. During Hurricane Harvey, more than 40 industrial facilities in East Houston shut down and restarted, releasing nearly 2,000 tons of excess emissions in addition to normal operations. Other environmental hazards included chemical plant explosions, flooded Superfund sites. Now a new Texas A&M study that included the Manchester area of East Houston shows these potentially carcinogenic pollutants were distributed across the state by wind and flooding. Researchers said the post-disaster environmental exposures added to ongoing chronic environmental exposures, and also noted, quote, the tandem growth of disaster frequencies and populations living near industrialized areas has brought greater attention to the potential health effects of environmental contamination associated with joint natural and technological disasters. And talk about the fact that the head of recovery itself is the head of one of the largest oil companies in the world.
I mean, it's really upsetting to see that Odom was appointed as the recovery czar. And, you know, it's also...
And who he is.
And who he is and his long history, right? It was reported a few weeks ago, too, that he actually profited from homes that were built in the reservoir. Direct conflict of interest. And, you know, as my dad says, you know, there was extensive flooding, widespread flooding on the west side, but on the east side, the communities there are flooded with chemicals every day. And we saw an upsurge of that during the storm, before the storm, and after the storm, you know, with these shutdowns and restarts, but also the spills and leaks, you know, that weren't reported until communities got active and started voicing their opinions, and witnessing, these spills.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. That's Brian Paris with the Sierra Club in Tejas. Dr. Robert Bullard, father of the environmental justice movement. When we come back, we'll also be joined by Hilton Kelly, who's in Port Arthur outside Texas, just got a FEMA trailer. And Cesar Espinosa, undocumented himself, represents so many undocumented immigrants and what they've experienced since the hurricane 6 months ago. Stay with us.
Well, it's flooding down in Texas, and all the telephone lines are down. Ooh, way down in Texas, and all the telephone lines are down. Oh, I'm trying to call my pretty woman, and I just can't get a single sound.
Texas Flood, performed by Fenton Robinson. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, it's been 6 months since Hurricane Harvey caused historic flooding in Houston, Texas, the fourth largest city in the United States. Well, we continue our roundtable discussion on the state of the city and the environmental justice movement in the wake of the storm. Joining us is Dr. Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice, Brian Paris of the Sierra Club, undocumented immigrant activist Cesar Espinosa, and the Goldman Environmental Prize winner Hilton Kelly, who just received his FEMA trailer 6 months after the storm. Hilton Kelly, I'd like to go to you. We heard about the budget deal that Congress made, about $90 billion in disaster assistance is supposedly coming to Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and California to help the residents there adjust to and recover from these disasters. Could you talk about what's been happening in Texas and the problem with this federal aid, that it's got to go through the states? It doesn't necessarily go directly to the localities affected, and how that, what happens in the process of this aid getting to the actual victims?
Hilton Kelly, that question was for you, and also...
Yes, you referring that question to me?
Yes, Hilton Kelly, yes, to you.
Yes. Yes. Well, what's happening down on the ground here in the Port Arthur, Texas, is that we have a lot of folks that have been displaced, a lot of apartment renters, a lot of homeowners. And of course, FEMA came out and they assessed the properties, but many of the properties that were assessed were unfairly assessed. Most people are having to appeal the judgment for what they received to help do repairs. Many of the residents in our area were given a certain amount of funding to help with those repairs, but it's not enough. About 80% of the folks that receive FEMA assistance are appealing that decision in our community because it's well below what contractors have bidded for work that needs to be done. And I am included in that band of folks. We have at least 50% additional damage that bill that FEMA just seemed to, but we are appreciative for what we do get, but yet it's just not enough to rebuild. And those folks who are renters, many of the apartment complexes in this area, the bottom half of those apartment complexes, the people that live downstairs are still, people should have a right to return. Many of them were brought to places like Dallas, Louisiana, places around Louisiana, and other areas north of Texas. It's really a mess, even though a lot of times the media it's not as much anymore, but people are really suffering behind the scenes economically, and many of our elders are just living in squalor because FEMA did not see that their homes were damaged to them, so that therefore they didn't give them any money. Many people did not get anything from FEMA.
We're going to turn to Cesar Espinosa, who is head of FIEL, who represents undocumented immigrants throughout Houston. So hard hit, the double whammy of the hurricane that hit everyone, and also the precarious position that you and so many of them are in. Cesar, if you can talk about what's happened in this 6 months. I mean, you have a spending bill that included funding for FEMA, but not for DACA and for dealing with the crisis that you are dealing with in Houston.
Thank you for having us. And it's really important to point out that the undocumented community was dealing with multiple storms at the time. At the time that the actual storm was happening, there was the storm with SB4, there was a storm with DACA, and actually soon after, right after the storm passes, Donald Trump announces that they're rescinding the DACA program. So we have, one of the stories that I like to highlight is the story of Jesus Contreras, who was a paramedic during Harvey, saving lives, and undocumented immigrants saving Houstonian lives without asking for immigration status. And he comes home at the end of the week just to find out that his DACA protection is going to be over, even though he gave everything during that week, worked 24 hours almost every day to make sure that Houstonians were safe. So it's been very perilous in the last couple of months. As we know, Congress has been trying to, quote unquote, start negotiations on immigration, but unfortunately, because of the government deadlock, we haven't really gone anywhere. So we are still dealing with multiple. The other thing is important to highlight is that we may not know how many undocumented people were affected by Harvey, because a lot of people just did not come forward. So we still continue to be a population that remains under the radar, that's going to be, has moved around and has faced many of these woes just by themselves.
And Cesar, what about this whole issue of if you're undocumented and you were a victim of the storm or you lost your home? Clearly, FEMA and the federal government will likely not provide aid, but what about local authorities and the local city government? Have they tried to step into the breach here?
At the beginning, there was a lot of support for the undocumented community. A lot of organizations were coming forward. They were asking for people to go into the shelters without asking for immigration status. The mayor came out and very forcefully said that folks would not be asked for status when going to shelters. Unfortunately, in the more long-term approach, we have not seen a lot of the aid that has come to the remainder of the community come to the undocumented community. So there's still disparities there, and that's created issues because, like I said, a lot of people were living in precarious conditions because they could not, because of their lack of status, a lot of landlords were taking advantage of them, and it still continues to happen. A lot of these folks are moving out to other apartment complexes or other homes where, because of their undocumented status, people are taking advantage of them. So there's many, we could talk for hours about all the disparities that are happening not only in Houston, but more in depth to the undocumented community. So we are asking city government to step in. We're asking the federal government also to step in and help out everybody equitably.
I want to read a part of a Houston Chronicle column headlined, "After Harvey, Houston needs petrochemicals more than ever." Quote, "What we don't need, though, is the hyperbole coming from environmental groups like the Sierra Club last week. For as long as I can remember, my hometown of Houston has been littered with dangerous chemical plants, oil and gas refineries, and hazardous waste facilities," Brian Paris, a Sierra Club organizer, wrote in a statement. He goes on, "These sites have caused devastation for my family, my friends, my neighbors for years, polluting our air and water with deadly toxins." Yes, he really did say devastation, the op-ed says. And it goes on to conclude, "In fact, these plants are critical to rebuilding after true devastation." That was the Houston Chronicle's business columnist. It was the day we broadcast the toxic tour, Brian, that we did with you, that Houston Chronicle went on the attack against you. So talk about this. The response of this business columnist was, "We need plastics." And don't engage in hyperbole, Brian.
Well, you know, it has been devastating, and I think thousands, tens of thousands of people would agree. And to the Paul Tomlinson, I would ask him, to get up and pick up all the plastics that are now littered across the bayous that have just recently been reported in Houston. What we don't need is language that dismisses the real dangers, the causes that have exacerbated these storms and made them more frequent. What we don't need is hyperbole on the other side, saying that everything is fine. Everything is not fine. And, people are getting organized. I don't think it's a simple answer. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I will say that folks in Houston are getting organized. They're working with unions. They're working with undocumented populations. They're working with, a whole range of communities that have not spoken, or had the ability to communicate and work together. That's happening right now. And, we're doing that in a way that hopefully will get us off of our dependence on these fossil fuel, products. And there's an explosion of, facilities that are being proposed right now on the coast, putting even more communities at risk. LNG facilities, pipelines, and plastics.
Yeah, well, I'd like to go back to Dr. Robert Bullard. Texas is a well-known conservative state. I'm wondering, your long history dealing with environmental issues there, do you get a sense that the residents of Texas, after this series of continuing more ferocious storms, have had any kind of change of perspective or viewpoint on the issue of climate change?
Well, I think when you talk with individuals on the ground that are on the front line of flooding and other environmental problems, you start to get a sense that many people have begun to see something something that needs to change, even if climate change may be a bad word in some of their vocabulary. They are saying that there's more support for moving toward a cleaner energy infrastructure and renewables. They also are talking about trying to build in a way that will become much more sustainable. And so you get mixed messages, and depending on where you talk to in our major metropolitan areas, you find much more acceptance of dealing with issues around climate and issues around sustainability and issues around building community resilience. And so I do think that you'll get more and more positive reaction from people in our major cities as opposed to some of the rural areas where they may still hold on to this idea that climate change is a hoax.
Cesar Espinosa, your most critical need now that you would say as we wrap up?
I think it's important that our community gets a lot more help. We are being overlooked, continue to be overlooked, and in a city that prides themselves on being the welcoming city to all people, I think we should also take into account the undocumented people. So it's, one of the messages that we also want to send out to the federal government is that, once again, immigrants prove that we are here not only to build up the city prior to the storm, but during the storm and after the storm. There's a massive influx of workers coming in and making Houston and rebuilding Houston and putting back into Houston so much of what has been given to them. So contributions are endless, and we hope that we no longer are overlooked in this process of recovery.
Brian Paris, 10 seconds.
Immigrants make Houston stronger. Unions make Houston stronger. People like Dr. Bullard, Hilton Kelly, Juan Parras, Patricia Gonzalez, so many folks make Houston stronger. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank so much for you all giving us this 6-month review. Brian Paris, organizer with Sierra Club's Beyond Dirty Fuels campaign, co-founder of board member of TEJAS, Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services. Cesar Espinosa, executive director of FIAL, a Houston-based nonprofit that helps undocumented members of the city's Latino community. Dr. Robert Bullard, distinguished professor at Texas Southern University, known as the father of environmental justice. And thanks so much to Hilton Kelly, environmental justice activist. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.